On behalf of the City of St. John, we would like to express our sincere appreciation for the opportunity to discuss municipal property tax reform with you today. I want to start by being clear to the committee and to all presenters from each of the great organizations that have appeared before you that the City of St. John is not anti-industry. The City of St. John is pro-business. All industry, and especially heavy industry in St. John, contributes significantly to the fabric of this province in employment, investment, and community outreach. We all benefit from having a strong business base. The primary request in Motion 31 is to study heavy industrial property tax assessment, exemptions, and benefits. With respect to the scope of the committee, the City of St. John's interests are not solely the property taxation of heavy industry. St. John is interested in discussing the need for comprehensive municipal tax reform, leading to fair and equitable tax policy. This reform is critical to the financial sustainability and viability of all municipalities and to the future of our province. Today we offer the committee a two-part presentation. I will present the first half with some illustrative tax assessment examples for the committee to consider. The examples are anecdotal and are not designed to offer conclusions or to provide judgments. They are admittedly controversial and certainly open to other points of view and explanations. They are nonetheless offered since we believe they provide an opportunity for committee members to pause and reflect on some of the challenges associated with the current property tax regime within the province. I will often use the expression, "Does this make sense?" throughout my presentation. I pose it as a question since it would only be through a comprehensive property tax review that appropriate conclusions could be drawn. In the second part of the presentation, City Manager John Collin will provide the committee a series of recommendations from a St. John perspective. The comparison between the City of St. John and Strathcona County in Alberta is well documented. As reported by the CBC, two oil refineries in Strathcona County with a combined production capacity similar to the refinery in St. John pay $26.4 million in property taxes compared to approximately $5 million the refinery pays in St. John. The primary reason for the dramatic difference is that in Strathcona County, machinery and equipment is fully assessed and taxed. As a result, in Strathcona, property tax revenue from industry represents the highest percentage of property tax collected compared to the residential class and the commercial class. In St. John, it's the opposite. Property tax revenue from industry represents the lowest percentage of property tax collected compared with the residential class and the commercial class. Does this make sense? The counter-argument would be that taxing machinery and equipment is an outlier in Alberta, and in many other provinces, machinery and equipment is exempt or not part of property tax law. Because every province deals with property tax and other sources of tax revenue differently, making comparisons is problematic without a detailed analysis of all facts and figures. That said, the stark difference in property tax paid between the Strathcona refineries and the oil refinery in St. John cannot be ignored and must be considered in all comprehensive review. But let's put the argument of taxing machinery and equipment aside for a minute and take a look at the Co-op refinery in Regina. Regina, Saskatchewan is an area like New Brunswick that does not tax machinery and equipment. The Co-op refinery has a capacity of 130,000 barrels per day compared to the Irving Oil refinery in St. John at 320,000 barrels per day. However, the assessment of the refinery in Regina is approximately $297 million compared to the refinery in St. John at approximately $102 million. Does it make sense that the Co-op refinery is one-third the size of the refinery in St. John, but is assessed at almost 3 times more? Our examples are not focused solely on the oil and gas industry. We would ask the committee to also reflect on a few other interesting statistics. Does it make sense that the railcar terminal in St. John pays less property tax to the city than the Tim Hortons across the street from it? Does it make sense that the regional hospital in St. John is assessed at almost the same value as the combined assessments of 9 major industries within our city limits? Does it make sense that St. John has the highest concentration of heavy industry in the province that contributes the most to the provincial GDP, and yet the overall property tax assessment for industry is almost 4% lower today than it was in 2013? During the same time frame, the industrial assessments in Moncton and Fredericton have grown between 17 and 20%. This means that industrial property tax revenue in St. John is approximately $775,000 lower today in 2019 than it was in 2013. We completely understand that industry requires a competitive economic environment in order to thrive, and that tax assessments may be adjusted accordingly. But when these tax adjustments are made for economic reasons, the city loses millions of dollars in revenue, and other taxpayers must make up the loss of that revenue. There needs to be a way to compensate cities for these imposed losses in income. St. John is home to Atlantic Canada's highest concentration of heavy industry, as reflected on this slide. Our city is unique. This extensive concentration of heavy industry actually coexists within residential neighborhoods. Residential neighborhoods which are adjacent bear risks such as the reduced value of their properties, higher service costs, damage to their roads, and living with the risks of heavy industrial incidents. This slide serves as an example of reduced property values. The property on the left is a property in Quispamsis, an outlying community within the Greater St. John region. This property looks very similar to the property on the right within the city limits, but the assessment is 28% lower in St. John. You can see in the St. John picture the presence of industry behind the property. We offer the media headlines on the following slides not to be anti-industry, but to give a visual of the reality of the risks St. John residents live with in cohabitating with heavy industry, including the need for the city to have the proper first responders available and ready to deploy. Municipal tax reform is not just a St. John issue. The 8 cities of New Brunswick have called upon the provincial government to implement tax reforms. The Union of the Municipalities of New Brunswick publicly advocates for, and I quote, sustainable municipal finances and tax reform, and the Association of Francophone Municipalities has repeatedly requested a commission on the municipal tax reform that would look at all elements of taxation. Mr. Jean-Guy Finn made important recommendations on municipal reform in a comprehensive report commissioned in 2008 by the government of the day. The report highlights New Brunswick's outdated legislation, the need for structural change to ensure that 90% of the population work and live and pay their taxes to one authority, calls for the abolition of the unconditional grant and the transfer of tax room from the province to municipalities, and he recommends the regionalization of key services. I will end my portion of this presentation by first recognizing the province's commitment to lead municipal tax reform as detailed in the report Sustaining St. John, a 3-part plan. The report states, and I quote, "The province will lead a comprehensive review of current local government property tax policy as well as any new property tax related tools which would benefit local governments." Today we have more questions than answers. We hope the province's comprehensive review of property tax will yield a fair taxation regime that satisfies the needs of municipalities within our province while protecting the requirement to keep our businesses competitive in national and global markets. The city manager will highlight our overall recommendations later, but for now, let me close with the questions shown on this slide. In the interest of time, I won't read them since they are self-explanatory. They are extremely important to the debate. Thank you, and I will now hand the presentation over to City Manager John Collin.
Thank you, Your Worship, Chair, and committee members. So why is this issue so important to the City of St. John? Let me present some important facts that will help explain our current situation. St. John has the highest property tax rate, almost 40% higher than our neighboring communities, as well as the highest water rates in the province. We would like to offer a more competitive tax environment for families wishing to live in St. John and for businesses wishing to locate in our city. But the current situation is tying our hands. Property tax reform is vital to the city. If we look at the city's revenue resources within this pie chart, you will see we are extremely limited. Property tax reform is vital to the city. If we look at the city's revenue sources on this pie chart, you'll see that we are extremely limited. Property tax is one of the few taxes a municipality can levy and represents the majority of a municipality's total revenue. As you can see on this slide, almost 80% of St. John's revenue is from property taxes. Although we are pursuing other municipal reforms to help diversify our revenue streams, those opportunities have limits. Therefore, tax reform must also be part of the solution. We have experienced low growth in the city's tax base, averaging less than 1% over the last 6 years. This low growth in revenue is trailing basic inflation and cost of living indexes. Our costs escalate year over year in areas such as wages, goods, and operating supplies, but our ability to pay has not grown at the same pace. We are proud of the fact that despite these inflationary pressures on costs, we have held the line on property tax for 11 straight years. We have done so through continual efficiency initiatives and an approach of austerity. Moving to more specific data germane to this committee, based on the 2019 operating budget of $125 million in property tax revenue, approximately $12 million or 9% comes from heavy industry, and light industry pays approximately $10.5 million or 8%. Industry brings tremendous economic benefits to the province and our region. St. John is home to New Brunswick's primary industrial base, including Canada's largest oil refinery, which was responsible for $7.6 billion of merchandise exports, or nearly 60% of New Brunswick's total exports in 2017. Over the past 10 years, nearly 28% of non-residential construction, including associated investments, have been in the St. John region, with the majority of those investments within city limits. The question we ask is whether St. John is receiving its fair share of the economic benefits within the context of the current municipal property tax system. I would like to remind committee members that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities commissioned a report some years ago that showed that for every tax dollar collected in Canada, only 8 cents goes to the municipal level. The remaining 92 cents are shared between the provincial and federal levels of government. Therefore, it's safe to say that the margins are very tight for cities. And since nobody truly wants new tax, there must be a concerted effort to explore redistribution of tax that is already being collected. The property tax system in New Brunswick needs to be reformed. Municipalities in the province of New Brunswick have less control over property tax than other municipalities across the country. Municipalities in New Brunswick set a single residential tax rate, and all other classes of customers are regulated at a rate of a multiple of 1.5 set in provincial legislation. This provides no flexibility to cater to specific regional requirements, nor does it empower communities. Municipal empowerment is a growing trend throughout our nation, and New Brunswick seems to be lagging in this regard. Kitchen & Slack, a third-party consulting firm hired by the city to review the province's provincial tax regime and its impacts on the city, stated during their presentation to our Common Council in 2017, and I quote, "We noticed that property tax system in New Brunswick is highly controlled by the provincial government. In fact, it's probably the most controlled by provincial government of any province here in Canada," end quote. The City of St. John is pro-business and wants industry to thrive. A thriving industry benefits the city, the region, and the province. However, we have to ask, are the economic benefits shared equitably between the City of St. John and the province, considering the risks and costs borne by St. John taxpayers? The province receives the greatest financial benefit from industry with not only property taxes, but also direct and indirect income taxes, sales taxes, fuel tax, licenses, and fees. The St. John region generates between 20 and 25% of the provincial GDP, largely due to industry. Currently, the province draws approximately $46 million of provincial property tax out of St. John annually and provides in return $17 million in unconditional grant. Since 2008, almost $240 million of net property tax has left the city for the provincial coffers. Since 2008, almost $240 million of net property tax has left the city for the provincial coffers. Property tax experts Kitchen and Slack looked at the fairness of the property tax system and have recommended that the property tax is not an appropriate provincial tax to fund redistributive services such as health and education, and that the province should gradually get out of levying property taxes completely. This should sound familiar. Mr. Jean-Guy Finn's recommendations to the provincial government in 2008 suggested the same in order to transfer tax room to the municipalities. Kitchen and Slack also concluded that including machinery and equipment in the property tax base, for example for oil and gas refineries, would result in fairer treatment of all manufacturing and processing plants and reduce the distortion in production techniques created by exempting one factor of production. If by doing so there is a concern about the impact on economic activity, the non-residential property tax rate could be lowered accordingly. Understanding that comprehensive tax reform will take a few years to implement, the city proposed to the provincial government a first phase of property tax reform that we believe made a lot of sense as one element of a potential decision by the province to gradually vacate levying property taxes. The proposal was simple. 100% of heavy industry property taxes be retained by the host city, meaning the city would keep the provincial portion of heavy industry property tax revenue. In the case of St. John, this would mean somewhere between $8 and $9 million annually. The redistribution of $8 to $9 million would not cost industry anything, but it would be transformational for the city and yet negligible for the province, representing less than 0.1% of the province's $10 billion in annual revenue. It could also be rolled out to the other municipalities. The exact cost of the entire program is not known to us, but it can be estimated at approximately $30 million based on the Provincial Finance Department's estimate of $1.4 billion of heavy industry within the province. If the policy decision is limited to just heavy industry, vice all industry, the provincial impact would be quite small, and yet the impact at municipal level would be dramatic. This proposal offers a pragmatic and affordable solution for the province to relieve immediately some of the burden experienced by municipalities. To use St. John as the example, this slide shows that provincial revenue has increased by approximately 20% over 5 years. Yet, during the same time period, the city's revenue has increased by a minuscule 1%. One must ask, what level of government is best positioned to absorb the cost of change in property tax reform? Moreover, municipalities, not the province, assume the responsibility for all costs associated with hosting heavy industry, such as increased wear and tear on roads and increased first responder capabilities. Yet these municipalities do not receive appropriate compensation for these increased costs, since approximately 40% of the total property tax collected by the province remains at the provincial level. The City of St. John supports the province's commitment to lead comprehensive municipal tax reform and would like the province to consider the recommendations shown on this slide and on which I've commented throughout my brief. Our hope is for the committee to remember the following conclusions from our presentation. First, St. John is pro-business. We recognize the economic contribution of heavy industry not only to the city, but to the province in regards to employment, investment, and community outreach. Second, St. John is unique with the heaviest industry concentration east of Montreal. Third, we ask that you consider the questions we posed on heavy industry property assessments. Do they make sense? Fourth, St. John does not receive an equitable distribution of tax revenue from heavy industry for the reasons shown on the slide. Fifth, St. John would like a first phase of municipal tax reform legislated as soon as possible, redistributing the provincial share of property tax on heavy industry, excluding light industry, to those who shoulder the costs, the municipalities. And finally, sixth, comprehensive municipal tax reform is critical to the sustainability of all municipalities in the province of New Brunswick. There is no doubt that the City of St. John will play a pivotal role in the future of the province. To be the best that we can be, we are working on many fronts. There are internal changes that we will make to become more effective and more efficient. Our staff motto is, grow the city, serve the city, be the community of choice. To achieve this, we are working hard, and our council is prepared to make all the necessary decisions. However, the reality in Canada is that municipalities are created and empowered by provinces. We need reforms. Property tax reform is one of the key elements to success. On behalf of our mayor, our common council, and our citizens, we thank you for your time.